The unexpected arrival. Sophia had always imagined her life unfolding like a fairy tale. She had met Lucas in college, and their connection was undeniable. She was captivated by his intelligence and ambition, while he admired her kindness and determination. Their love blossomed quickly, leading to a whirlwind romance and a beautiful wedding. Sophia had always dreamt of becoming a mother, and when she found out she was pregnant, she was overjoyed. Lucas was equally thrilled, eagerly awaiting the arrival of their first child. They planned everything meticulously. The nursery, the baby clothes, the parenting books. It seemed like nothing could go wrong. But life has a way of throwing curveballs, and nothing could have prepared them for what came next. At her 30-week ultrasound, the doctor looked at Sophia with a mix of surprise and concern. "You're carrying triplets," the doctor informed her, with a gentle smile. But Sophia's heart sank. She wasn't prepared for triplets. The pregnancy had already been difficult. She'd been exhausted, constantly nauseous, and struggling with high blood pressure. The thought of caring for 3 newborns overwhelmed her, but she refused to let it show. Lucas, however, was over the moon. He talked about how their family would be complete, how they would create a life full of joy and love for their children. They chose names, painted the nursery, and talked about the future with excitement. But Sophia couldn't shake the anxiety that kept creeping in. How would they manage? Was she strong enough to handle this? The labor came early, and Sophia was rushed to the hospital in the middle of the night. Lucas, who had always been supportive, was by her side. As the pain intensified, Sophia clutched his hand, whispering through the contractions that she needed him. "I'm here, Sophia. We're in this together," Lucas assured her. But with each wave of pain, her trust in him began to waver. She could feel his tension, a subtle shift that she couldn't quite put her finger on. The delivery was long and difficult, and when the babies finally came, 3 healthy babies, 2 girls and a boy, Lucas's face went pale. The room fell silent as the doctors and nurses congratulated Sophia and examined the babies. She lay there, exhausted, looking at her newborns, her heart swelling with love. But as she turned to Lucas to share that moment of joy, she saw it, his face twisted with confusion. Then something darker, anger. He stood frozen for a moment, looking at the babies as if they were foreign objects, his lips pressed into a thin line. Sophia tried to smile, but she could feel the air between them growing cold. The babies, each with dark skin and striking features, didn't resemble either of them. Sophia was white, and so was Lucas. The nurses and doctors didn't seem fazed by the baby's skin tone, but Sophia could see the shift in Lucas. His eyes darted back and forth between the babies and her, disbelief written across his face. "What's wrong, Lucas?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling. But before he could respond, he walked out of the room without a word. Sophia felt a chill run through her, as if the entire hospital had frozen in time. She assumed he just needed some air, needed to process everything. But as the hours passed, and the nurses continued to tend to her, Sophia's anxiety began to grow. Where was Lucas? Why hadn't he come back? Had she done something wrong? Finally, the door to her room swung open, and Lucas stepped in, but the man who walked through the door was not the same man she had married. His eyes were wide with disbelief, his jaw clenched in anger. He stood there for a moment, staring at her and the babies, as if trying to find some explanation, some reason for what had happened. I don't understand," he muttered, his voice distant. "How could this happen? These babies, how could they be like this?" Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. "Lucas, they're ours. These are our children." But Lucas wasn't listening. He shook his head in disbelief, his face contorting with a mixture of confusion and rage. I can't do this. I can't raise these children. They're not mine." Sophia's eyes widened in shock. "What are you talking about? Of course they're yours." Lucas took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but his hands were trembling. No, they're not. There's no way. I don't know whose they are, but they're not mine." His voice grew louder, as though he was trying to convince himself as much as her. The room grew unbearably tense. Sophia couldn't understand what was happening. "Lucas, you're scaring me. These are our babies, our children. You can't just walk away from them." But Lucas, still in shock, turned on his heel and walked out of the room. Sophia's heart shattered as she listened to his footsteps fade away down the hall. She was left alone, surrounded by her newborns, with nothing but confusion and fear. What had just happened? How had the man she loved, the man she had shared so much with, suddenly turned into someone she didn't recognize? It wasn't until the next morning that the reality of what was happening truly hit Sophia. She had been discharged from the hospital, but when she tried to contact Lucas, he refused to answer her calls. Desperate for answers, she made her way back to their home, hoping that things would somehow be resolved. But when she arrived, the door was locked. There was no sign of Lucas, and no indication that he had been there at all. The moment she stepped onto the porch, she saw it, a pile of bags tossed carelessly in front of the door. There was no note, no explanation, just the bags, filled with her things, everything she owned, packed and discarded. The door opened then, but it wasn't Lucas who appeared. It was a neighbor who had seen everything unfold. "He kicked you out," the neighbor said quietly. "He said you were going to have to go back too. I'm sorry, I don't know what he said, but he doesn't want you here anymore." Sophia couldn't speak. Her entire world had been ripped apart in a single moment. The man she had loved, the father of her children, was gone, and in his place was only bitterness, anger, and disbelief. What had gone wrong, and how would she survive? A new beginning, or so she thought. Sophia sat on the edge of the porch, staring blankly at the pile of bags scattered around her feet. The weight of the situation hung heavily in the air, suffocating her. Her mind raced as she tried to process what had just happened. How could Lucas, her husband, the man she trusted, have turned his back on her, on their children, without even a second thought? The reality of her circumstances began to settle in, and for the first time, Sophia allowed herself to truly feel the sting of what had just transpired. She could still hear the sound of the door slamming shut behind her, still feel the cold emptiness of the house where she had once felt safe. What was she supposed to do now? Where was she supposed to go? It had been an unimaginable day, one that seemed like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. She had given birth to 3 beautiful babies, her triplets, her miracles. And instead of celebrating the joy of motherhood, she was left to face a cold, harsh reality alone. The weight of the bags in front of her suddenly felt unbearable. They were filled with her clothes, her belongings, all the physical remnants of a life she had worked so hard to build with Lucas. But none of it mattered now. Lucas was gone, and she was left with nothing but questions and confusion. And yet, through the pain, something inside of her stirred, a flicker of determination. She couldn't let this be the end of the story. Not like this. Not after everything she had been through. Sophia took a deep breath, wiping away the tears that had started to fall. She looked down at her 3 newborns, still in the car seat beside her, each of them gently stirring in their sleep. They needed her to be strong, to fight for them. Her heart filled with both love and a deep, inexplicable sorrow. The world outside felt like an endless battle. And yet, in that moment, she knew she could never give up. She would raise them, no matter what. With a newfound resolve, Sophia slowly gathered the bags, her movements shaky at first, but with purpose. She didn't have a plan, no clear direction, but she knew one thing for certain. She had to get out of there. She couldn't stay in that house anymore, not with the memory of what had happened fresh in her mind. Sophia didn't know where she would go, but she knew she had to leave the remnants of her past behind. The house, the life, the broken promises. She needed to sever all ties with what had once been her reality. She called her mother, hoping for some kind of solace, some place to turn. The phone rang and rang before the voicemail kicked in. "Mom, it's me, Sophia's voice cracked. "I need you. I don't know what to do. Lucas, he left. He kicked me out. I don't know where to go. I need help." Her heart sank as she ended the call. She didn't know if her mother would answer, or if she'd even be able to help her. The relationship with her parents had been strained for years. They had always been skeptical about her marriage to Lucas, and now, in this moment, she feared they might say, "I told you so." With no other choice, Sophia placed the call to a local women's shelter that she had heard about through a friend. It was a temporary solution, but one she desperately needed. After a brief conversation with the staff, she was told they could take her in, but she would have to wait for a bed to become available. "We'll be here for you when you're ready," the counselor assured her, her voice soft and understanding. With a sigh of relief, Sophia packed the car and carefully made her way to the shelter, the hum of the engine oddly comforting in the silence. The babies were restless, their soft cries in the backseat reminding her of the enormity of what she was now facing. But no matter how exhausted, no matter how lost she felt, she had one thing she could rely on: her love for her children. The shelter wasn't glamorous by any means. It was a modest building in a quieter part of town, with a welcoming, though somewhat worn, exterior. When Sophia arrived, a volunteer helped her unload her things, leading her inside to a small room that would be her new home for the time being. There was a cot, a small dresser, and a window with a view of the parking lot. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The other women staying there greeted her with warmth, some offering smiles, others nodding in silent solidarity. Sophia could sense the shared understanding in their eyes, the kind of knowing that only comes from having lived through hardship. They didn't ask her about her story. They didn't have to. Sophia knew the weight of their own lives was just as heavy as hers. She spent the next few weeks adjusting to life in the shelter. The days blurred together, getting up early, feeding the babies, changing diapers, and learning how to navigate the logistics of being the single mother of 3. The nights were the hardest. In the quiet hours after the babies were asleep, Sophia would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. She couldn't shake the pain of Lucas's rejection, the way he had walked away without so much as a second glance. She replayed his words in her mind, over and over, as though searching for something that might make sense of it all. But there was no clarity, no explanation. It didn't make sense that the man she had loved and trusted had abandoned her in her most vulnerable moment. The shelter's counselors tried to help her through the emotional toll, offering therapy sessions and support groups. But Sophia knew she couldn't rely on them forever. She had to find a way to rebuild her life on her own. In time, Sophia began to meet with lawyers to discuss her options. She knew that she would have to fight for custody of her children, for their future. But every legal step she took felt like an uphill battle. She was living in a shelter, had no income, and was now a single mother raising 3 infants on her own. The mountain ahead of her seemed insurmountable, but she refused to back down. She found herself reflecting on the day her babies were born. The look on Lucas's face, the confusion, the anger, had haunted her. But the triplets, with their wide eyes and dark skin, were hers. They were innocent. They didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this mess. In the weeks that followed, Sophia found a job working as a part-time receptionist at a local clinic. It wasn't much, but it allowed her to get by, to make a small income to contribute to the shelter's expenses. She learned to juggle her responsibilities, working during the day, caring for the babies at night. The exhaustion was overwhelming at times, but it gave her a sense of purpose. Every small victory, every step forward, felt like progress. Yet every time she saw a family together, every time she saw a father lovingly holding his child, her heart broke a little more. Lucas's absence left an undeniable void. She couldn't ignore the way he had walked away from his family, his flesh and blood, without a second thought. It left her with more questions than answers. But as the months passed, something shifted inside Sophia. She could no longer afford to dwell on Lucas or the past. She had her children to think of, and they were counting on her. The more time she spent with them, the more she realized how much love she had to give. Her triplets, with their sweet smiles and innocent laughter, had already taught her more about strength and resilience than she could have ever imagined. They were the ones who gave her hope when she had none left, and with each passing day, she grew more determined to prove to herself, and to them, that she could give them the life they deserved, even if she had to fight for it with every ounce of strength she had. Lucas had walked away, but Sophia had learned one vital truth. She didn't need him. She had the love of her children, and that was all that mattered. The future was uncertain, but Sophia knew that, no matter what happened, she would never give up. She was their mother, and that was more than enough. The strength of a mother's resolve. The days had become a blur of diaper changes, late-night feedings, and moments of quiet exhaustion that crept into Sophia's bones like the weight of the world. Despite the overwhelming challenges, there was a quiet fire inside her that refused to go out. Her triplets, now several months old, had begun to develop their own personalities, and Sophia's heart swelled with pride each time one of them smiled or babbled in the early stages of speech. They were growing stronger, more beautiful every day. And so was she. Living in the shelter was difficult, and the reality of it all often felt like a punch to the gut. Sophia had once dreamed of a comfortable home, a happy family, and a future with Lucas. But here she was, her life altered beyond recognition, living in a small room with 3 babies who depended on her for everything. The shelter, while providing safety, was far from ideal. The rooms were cramped, and the atmosphere, though supportive, was heavy with the pain of its residents. Many of the women had been through their own heart-wrenching experiences: domestic abuse, addiction, and hardship. While they shared a deep bond of understanding, it also felt like a constant reminder of how broken the world could be. Sophia found herself becoming close with a few of the women there. There was Emma, a young woman in her 20s who had fled an abusive relationship, and Rita, a grandmother who had found herself homeless after her husband's passing. They were all struggling, but in different ways, and yet they understood each other in a way no one else could. They never judged Sophia, never asked too many questions about the details of her life. Instead, they became her support system, her lifeline. They would offer to watch the babies when she needed a break, share advice, and sometimes just sit with her in silence, understanding the weight she carried on her shoulders. Even with the comfort of these new friendships, Sophia's isolation was profound. She rarely spoke to anyone from her past life. She couldn't bear the thought of seeing her old friends or family, knowing how different everything had become. She felt like a ghost of the woman she once was, so full of hope, so full of plans for the future. Now the future seemed uncertain, fogged by the pain of betrayal and the ever-present worry about how she would make it through. One particularly difficult evening, after a long day of managing the babies and a grueling shift at the clinic, Sophia sat alone on the edge of her cot, staring down at her children, who were fast asleep in their crib. The room was dim, the only light coming from the small lamp on the bedside table. Her hands rested in her lap, and her eyes were tired, but her gaze lingered on the sleeping faces of her triplets. They were all she had left. "I'm doing this for you," she whispered, as if trying to reassure herself as much as them. "I'll never stop. I'll never give up on you." It wasn't the first time she had said it, but the words carried weight tonight. She knew the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but she also knew that nothing in the world could be harder than the moment she had already survived, the moment Lucas had walked out of her life. But there was something inside of Sophia, a core of strength that she hadn't fully recognized until now. The more time she spent alone, in silence with her babies, the more she began to understand that she wasn't just surviving, she was fighting. And fighting was something that came naturally to her. She had always been a fighter, but this was a different kind of battle, the kind that no one could help her with. This battle was hers alone. The next morning, when Sophia returned to the clinic after another sleepless night, she found herself more focused than ever. She wasn't just doing this to get by anymore. She was doing this for the future, her future, and the future of her children. She was starting to understand that, though Lucas's rejection had shattered her world, it had also opened a door to her own strength. She was no longer living for the person she had been. She was living for the mother she had become. The clinic had always been a place of stability, a small corner of normalcy in a life that felt anything but. It wasn't glamorous, just a quiet, underfunded medical office in the heart of the city. But it was a start. Sophia had quickly learned the ins and outs of the office, helping patients check in, scheduling appointments, answering phones. It wasn't a high-paying job, but it provided her with just enough to get by, to keep a roof over her head and food on the table. But she knew it wasn't enough. Not for long. One afternoon, as she was sorting through patient files, Sophia overheard one of the doctors, Dr. Wheeler, talking to a colleague about an opening for a full-time administrative position at the clinic. The job was better paying and came with benefits, but it also required more hours, something Sophia hadn't been able to commit to before, with her baby still so young and her schedule limited by the shelter's constraints. But now, something inside her stirred. She knew this could be her chance. It wasn't just a job, it was an opportunity. An opportunity to start building the kind of life her children deserved. Without thinking, Sophia approached Dr. Wheeler during her lunch break. "Excuse me, Dr. Wheeler," she said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "I heard you talking about the full-time position. I'd like to apply." Dr. Wheeler, a kind woman in her early 40s, smiled at her. "Of course, Sophia. I've been meaning to talk to you about it. You've been doing an excellent job here, and I think you'd be a great fit. But are you sure? It's a full-time commitment, and I know you've got your hands full with the babies." Sophia took a deep breath, gathering her courage. She didn't know how she was going to make it work, but she had to try. "I'm sure. I'll make it work. I need this. For my children." Dr. Wheeler studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Well, I'll put in a good word for you. I think you're exactly what we need. I'll talk to HR about the details." Sophia left the conversation with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. There was a small light at the end of the tunnel, and she was determined to reach it. Over the next few days, she worked tirelessly to prepare herself for the full-time job. She arranged child care with some of the other women at the shelter who had offered to help watch the babies, and she stayed up late, studying everything she could about office management and medical administration. She had a long way to go, but for the first time, Sophia felt like she was building something for herself, a future. The job at the clinic wasn't just a paycheck, it was a stepping stone toward independence. It was a way to prove to herself, and to her children, that she could make it on her own. As the weeks passed, Sophia's determination only grew stronger. The full-time job was demanding, and there were days when she felt like she was on the brink of exhaustion. But every time she saw her triplets' smiling faces, every time they reached for her arms, she found the energy to keep going. She was their mother, and that meant everything. In the quiet moments, when she could finally breathe, Sophia reflected on everything she had been through. She thought about Lucas, the man who had walked away without a second thought. And though the pain of his betrayal still stung, she found herself feeling more and more grateful that he had left. Because in the absence of his love, Sophia had found something even stronger, her own. And that love, that unbreakable bond with her children, would carry her through anything. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was thriving. Slowly but surely, Sophia was building the life she had always dreamed of, for herself and for her triplets. And nothing was going to take that away. A mother's unseen strength. As the months passed, Sophia's life began to take on a new rhythm. It wasn't easy, but each day she faced felt like a quiet victory, a step forward in a journey she never expected to embark on. The full-time position at the clinic was everything she had hoped for. It gave her financial independence, stability, and the ability to take control of her future. She felt a sense of pride every time she clocked in for her shift, knowing that she was building something meaningful, something that could change the course of her life and her children's lives. The job itself was more demanding than she'd anticipated. With 3 babies at home and a full-time position that required her to manage patient records, schedule appointments, and assist with billing, the days blurred into one long stretch of exhaustion. But Sophia refused to let it overwhelm her. She had learned the hard way that she couldn't afford to let her dreams slip through her fingers, not when her children's futures were at stake. In the mornings, she woke up before dawn, her body still weary from the night before, but she forced herself to rise. She'd breastfeed the babies, change their diapers, and prepare them for the day. Then, after a quick breakfast, she'd rush out the door, knowing she was about to spend a long day at the clinic. When she arrived, the hum of the office, the steady rhythm of phone calls and patients coming and going, offered her a sense of normalcy, a brief respite from the chaos of her personal life. At the clinic, Sophia found solace in the work. She loved organizing the files, managing the appointments, and interacting with the patients. It felt good to be needed, to be part of something bigger than herself. But it wasn't just the job that kept her going. It was the promise she had made to her children. Every morning, she looked at them before leaving and whispered, "I'm doing this for you. I'm going to make your lives better." Their smiles, their innocent giggles, and the way they reached for her arms every time she came home made all the sleepless nights, the exhaustion, and the heartache worthwhile. At the shelter, the other women had come to know Sophia's routine. They saw her struggle, but they also saw her strength. Emma, Rita, and the others had become like family to her. Each of them had a story of survival, and each of them had fought their own battles. They took turns helping with the babies when Sophia had late shifts, and when she was home, they would sit together, sharing stories and comforting each other in their own unique ways. But Sophia's biggest support came from within herself. The woman she was becoming, the resilient, resourceful, and determined mother, was beginning to emerge. She'd spent so many months being defined by her circumstances, the woman who had been abandoned, the woman who had lost everything. But now, she realized, she was defining herself by something far more powerful, the love she had for her children, and the strength that came from that love. One evening, after another long day of the clinic, Sophia sat alone in the small shelter room, the babies asleep in their crib. She felt the weight of the day, the exhaustion pulling at her like an anchor, but there was something else there, too, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. Hope. The shelter was no longer the place of desperation it had once been. It had become a stepping stone, a place where she had rebuilt herself. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't permanent. But for now, it was home. And she had a plan, one that, for the first time in a long time, felt like it could actually work. Sophia had been saving every penny she could, putting aside what little money she had left after covering the basics. The next step, she knew, was to find a better living situation, a small apartment where she could raise her children with more space and privacy. The shelter had given her a roof over her head, but it was no place for 3 children to grow up. She had learned to navigate the system, to stretch every dollar. But she also knew that she needed to take the next step for herself and for the triplets. That evening, she made a decision. The next day, she would start looking for apartments. She wasn't sure how she would make it work financially. Renting an apartment on her own seemed like an impossible dream. But she knew she couldn't wait any longer. Her children deserved better. She deserved better. The following days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and paperwork. Sophia spent her breaks at work researching local apartments, calling landlords, and trying to find a place that would be within her budget. She had always been good at organizing, and now that skill was being put to the test. She had a small savings fund, a steady income from the clinic, and the support of the women at the shelter. But even with all that, it still felt like an uphill battle. Finally, after days of searching, Sophia found it, a small 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had ever dreamed of. The rent was affordable, and the landlord seemed kind and understanding. Sophia arranged a viewing, and when she stepped into the apartment for the first time, she felt a surge of excitement, tempered by a deep sense of fear. Could she really do this? Could she afford it? The apartment was modest, but it had everything she needed. A small living room, a functional kitchen, 2 bedrooms, one for her and one for the babies. The light streamed through the windows, and Sophia imagined her children running around, playing in the small space, their laughter filling the air. It was the beginning of something new, something real. The landlord, a man in his late 50s, listened to her situation with quiet understanding. He didn't judge her, didn't ask too many questions. He simply said, "I'll give you a chance. If you can manage the first month's rent and security deposit, you're welcome to move in." Sophia left the apartment feeling both hopeful and terrified. She had the first month's rent saved up, barely, but the security deposit would be a stretch. It was the kind of challenge that could break someone, but to Sophia, it felt like the final test. If she could pull this off, it would be the beginning of her new life. For the next few days, Sophia worked tirelessly, cutting back on every unnecessary expense, selling some of her old clothes and a few items that no longer served her. She made the hard decision to dip into her savings, but only enough to cover the deposit. The rest of her money was earmarked for the essentials: rent, groceries, and her children's needs. Every penny was accounted for, every dollar spent wisely. When the day came to sign the lease, Sophia was both exhilarated and terrified. She was stepping into the unknown, but this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't just surviving. She was building a future. The future she had promised herself, and the future she had promised her children. As she signed the lease, Sophia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. She was creating a life for herself, a life that was hers to shape. The road ahead was still uncertain, and there were challenges yet to come, but for the first time in a long while, Sophia allowed herself to feel proud of how far she had come. She had weathered the storm, and though the wind still howled, she was no longer afraid of the fight. She was ready for whatever came next, and when she walked into her new apartment for the first time, with her babies in her arms, Sophia knew one thing above all else: this was only the beginning. The weight of new beginnings. Sophia sat on the edge of the small, worn couch in her new apartment, the quiet hum of the city outside filling the otherwise still room. The sun had just set, casting a soft glow through the living room window and painting the walls with shades of amber and gold. It was a moment of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophia allowed herself to take a deep breath and let the weight of the day settle around her. Her new apartment wasn't much, but it was everything. The bare walls, the mismatched furniture, the faded carpet, these were all the signs of a new beginning. She had spent so many nights dreaming of this moment. She had imagined herself and her triplets in a place they could call their own, a space where they could grow, laugh, and find comfort in each other's company. And now, here it was. But even as she looked around, her heart swelled with a mixture of pride and anxiety. She had done it. She had made it this far, but there was still so much left to do. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her. Now that she had her own space, she needed to make it work. She had to find a way to pay the rent, to keep her job, to ensure that her children had everything they needed. The triplets, now crawling and exploring every corner of the apartment, were a whirlwind of energy and curiosity. Sophia watched them with a tired but contented smile. Their laughter echoed in the small room, filling the space with a sense of life, a reminder that this was no longer just a temporary situation. This was their home, their sanctuary, and she was determined to make it everything they deserved. She had already set up their cribs in one of the bedrooms, and while it was a tight fit, it was warm and safe. The second bedroom, which Sophia had claimed for herself, was simple, just a bed, a small dresser, and a few personal items. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. It was a place she could rest, a place where she could retreat after a long day of work. Sophia's heart swelled with gratitude as she thought of the long journey that had led her here. From the shelter to this small apartment, every step had been a battle, but she had fought with everything she had. She was no longer just surviving. She was living. She was building a life for herself and her children, one brick at a time. But with every step forward, there were challenges. The responsibility of managing the household, the finances, and the well-being of her children weighed heavily on Sophia's shoulders. The first few days in the apartment had been filled with the usual chaos, unpacking boxes, setting up routines, and figuring out how to balance work with the constant care her children needed. She had no extended family to help her, no partner to share the load. It was all on her. And while she was determined to make it work, there were moments when the exhaustion threatened to swallow her whole. The nights were the hardest. By the time the babies were asleep and the apartment was quiet, Sophia often found herself lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with worries about the future. Was she doing enough? Would she be able to keep up with the demands of the job? Would the apartment feel like a home, or was it just another stop along the way? But it was in those quiet moments of solitude that Sophia's resolve grew even stronger. She had already come so far. She had faced so many obstacles, had pushed through so much pain. And now she was here. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance anymore. She was a mother, a woman, and a force to be reckoned with. One evening, as she was folding laundry in the small kitchen, she heard a knock on the door. Startled, she wiped her hands on a dish towel and walked to the door, unsure of who could be visiting. When she opened the door, she found Emma, one of the women from the shelter, standing in the hallway with a big smile on her face. In her arms, she was holding a large bag of groceries. "Thought you might need some help settling in," Emma said, her voice warm and genuine. "I know it's not easy, starting over." Sophia was overwhelmed with gratitude. She hadn't expected any visitors, and certainly not someone bringing food. It was a gesture of kindness that spoke volumes. "Oh, Emma, you didn't have to do this," Sophia said, her voice thick with emotion. Emma shrugged, stepping inside and putting the bag on the counter. "We're family now, right? Besides, I know how hard it is to juggle everything. Thought you could use a little break." As they sat together in the modest living room, sharing a quiet meal, Sophia felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. The world outside could be harsh, and the weight of the past still lingered in her heart. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of friendship and the quiet joy of motherhood, Sophia knew that she had found something she hadn't realized she was missing: a community. She had thought she was alone in this, thought she had to carry the burden of everything on her own. But with the support of women like Emma and the others from the shelter, Sophia was starting to realize that survival didn't mean isolation. It meant leaning on others when the weight became too heavy and giving help when she was able. The more time passed, the more Sophia's new life began to take shape. She continued to work hard at the clinic, taking on extra hours when she could, and still making sure her children's needs came first. The apartment was beginning to feel more like home with every passing day. She had made a routine for herself and the babies: early morning feeds, a day at the clinic, and evenings spent playing with the triplets or reading them bedtime stories. But there were moments, still, when Sophia couldn't help but think about Lucas. His absence was a constant ache in her heart, one she could never fully escape. The more she thought about it, the more it became clear to her. Lucas had been a part of her life, but he was not the key to her happiness. It was her children and her ability to provide for them, to protect them, and to love them without reserve. That was the core of her strength. Lucas's rejection had been painful, yes, but it had also set her free. It had shown her that she didn't need anyone else to define her worth. She had her own identity now. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need his presence to be whole. In the stillness of the evening, after the babies had fallen asleep and the apartment was quiet once more, Sophia allowed herself to reflect. It was strange, really. Just a few short months ago, she had been sitting in a hospital room, alone and broken, facing the uncertainty of a future without her husband. Now she was a mother in her own right, a mother who had faced unimaginable odds and was still standing strong. She smiled softly to herself. No one could take this from her. No one could ever diminish the love she had for her children or the strength she had found within herself. And then, as if to confirm it, she heard the soft sound of one of her triplets stirring in the crib. Sophia stood, her heart full of love and gratitude, and went to her children. As she cradled the little one in her arms, she felt a renewed sense of purpose flood her being. She was building a life, and no matter how difficult it got, no matter the setbacks that were sure to come, Sophia was prepared to fight for it, for herself, and for her children. Because in the end, that's all that mattered. And nothing, not even the darkest chapters of her past, could ever take that away. The tipping point of transformation. A year had passed since Sophia had moved into the small apartment with her triplets. In that time, she had transformed, quietly, steadily, into a mother and a woman who no longer looked back. Each day, with its battles and victories, had shaped her into someone stronger than she could have imagined. The early days of uncertainty had given way to a deep, steadfast confidence in her ability to handle whatever came next. Still, life was far from easy. But now, as Sophia sat in her living room watching her children play on the floor, a sense of peace settled over her. The chaos of motherhood, the demands of her job, the constant juggle between work and home, it had all become a part of her routine. And somewhere in that routine, she had found a rhythm, a pace she could manage. It wasn't perfect. It was still exhausting. But there was no denying that things were better than they had been. The apartment was no longer the bare, empty place it had been when she first moved in. Sophia had taken the time to make it hers. The walls were adorned with family photos, pictures of her triplets, of her and the babies at various milestones, even a few snapshots from her days at the shelter with the women who had become her surrogate family. The couch, once plain and uncomfortable, was now adorned with colorful cushions that brightened up the space. The kitchen, though small, was filled with the sweet smell of homemade meals, something Sophia took pride in, even if she had to rush through the process most days. Most importantly, though, the apartment felt like a home, her home. But as she watched her triplets crawl across the living room floor, giggling as they chased after a stray ball, Sophia felt a pang in her chest. They had grown so much in a short time. It seemed like only yesterday they had been tiny newborns, fragile and dependent on her for everything. Now they were independent little beings, each with their own personality emerging more and more every day. Liam, the oldest, was a bundle of energy, always climbing, always moving. Ava, the middle child, had a quiet yet intense gaze, always observing, always thinking. And little Noah. Noah was the sensitive one, his heart so full of empathy it showed even in his baby blue eyes. She had watched them develop, seen how their individual traits began to surface. They were her joy. They were her reason. Sophia's life had been about survival for so long, but now it was about thriving. There was still no contact with Lucas. She didn't expect him to come back. She didn't want him to, at least not in any meaningful way. She had long accepted that their marriage, that life, was over. But even as she let go of the idea of a happy family with him, Sophia still struggled with feelings of abandonment. What would her children think of him, of the father who had rejected them, who had turned his back on them all without a second thought? Would they ever ask about him? Would they ever wonder why their father wasn't there, why their mother had to do everything on her own? The thought lingered at the back of her mind more often than she would admit, but each time she pushed it away. She couldn't afford to dwell on it. The babies were growing fast. They needed her to be strong. Sophia had found a rhythm at work as well. The clinic was busy, always bustling with patients and phone calls, but she had found her place. She had earned the respect of her colleagues and patients alike. And while the job still wasn't glamorous, Sophia had come to see it as much more than a paycheck. It had become a source of pride for her. She had proven, to herself more than anyone, that she could support herself and her children, that she was capable of standing on her own. It wasn't just about the money. It was about her identity as a woman, as a provider, and as a mother. But there was one thing Sophia knew she needed to change. She had been living this life, working, raising her children, making ends meet, for over a year now. She had made progress, yes, but her future, and the future of her children, still felt uncertain. She didn't want to stay stuck in this cycle forever. She wanted more. She needed to do something more for herself, for them. That evening, after putting the babies to bed, Sophia sat at her small desk with a notepad and a pen. The room was dark except for the soft light from the lamp beside her. She didn't usually take the time to write, but tonight she felt the urge to plan, to set some long-term goals. Her mind was alive with possibilities. She had always been an ambitious woman. Before Lucas, before the triplets, she had dreamed of a career, of a life where she could make a difference. She had always been passionate about health, about helping others, about providing care in ways that weren't always accessible. But she had pushed those dreams aside when she became pregnant and married. There hadn't been time for them then. She had focused on being a wife, a mother, and surviving in a world that didn't seem to want to make room for her. But now, in the quiet of her apartment, she realized something. It wasn't too late. It couldn't be. She wasn't going to let it be. She had already overcome so much. She wasn't going to stop now. Sophia grabbed the pen and began writing, jotting down ideas as they came to her. It started with simple thoughts. Maybe she could go back to school, take some online courses in medical administration or nursing. Maybe she could start a side business, something that would allow her to be more independent, something flexible that would give her the freedom to spend more time with her children. The possibilities were endless, and the more she thought about them, the more excited she became. She stopped writing for a moment and looked at her children's sleeping faces, their little bodies curled up in their cribs. They had no idea what their mother was planning, what she had set in motion. They had no idea how much they had changed her life, how much they had given her the strength to dream again. That night, Sophia couldn't sleep. Her mind buzzed with new ideas, with visions of the life she wanted to create. She wasn't just building a home for her children. She was building a future. She didn't know exactly what that future would look like, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to take the next step toward it. She didn't need Lucas to make her whole. She didn't need anyone's approval. All she needed was her children, her strength, and the resolve to keep moving forward. The next morning, Sophia took a deep breath as she set her plans into motion. She started researching online programs for medical degrees, nursing certifications, and business courses. She wrote down a list of things she needed to accomplish: getting childcare sorted, finding scholarships, saving for tuition. It was a long list, but for the first time in a long time, Sophia wasn't overwhelmed by it. Instead, she felt a rush of excitement, like a door had opened, and she was standing at the threshold, ready to walk through. There was so much more she could do, and she was ready. The woman who had once been broken by betrayal, the woman who had been left alone to raise 3 children, was now someone new, someone unrecognizable from the woman who had started this journey. Sophia had fought for her children. She had fought for her independence, and now she was fighting for her dreams. And no matter how hard the road ahead was, no matter how many obstacles she would face, she knew one thing for certain. She would never stop. Not now. Not ever. Because her story was just beginning.